Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the BMW R75. It's Wunderbike in 1/8 scale from Revell. The kit number is H1552 and it's a skill level 2 for the intermediate builder. It's been out of production for some time, but this vintage kit can still be found at online auction sites and garage sales. And there were also a number of versions of the bike released as well. This iconic gentleman's motorcycle was made famous in the Great Escape World War II movie featuring Steve McQueen. A little known secret is that those were actually Triumph TR6 bikes disguised as the venerable R75s. There's about 90 pieces molded in blue, chrome, black vinyl tubing and rubber tires with clear and water slide decals. Now, when you're done, it'll be about 10 inches long, 3 3/4 inches wide, and 5 inches high. As you can see, this is the open box review. We opened the box and there were the parts. Now, for the most part, we'll be using tube glue and sometimes super glue for strength on fragile parts and white glue for clear parts. But remember to heed the manufacturer's safety and use guidelines when using any of the products that you see or hear mentioned in the review. There are only a few decals for this kit, but they're always going to be old, so I suggest that you give them a little coat of decal bonder from somebody like Microscale, or a thin coat of clear lacquer to preserve the decals to put them in place. So go ahead and get these parts out of the kit, and we'll get started by assembling the cylinder halves of the left side, and then we'll glue those together with the cylinder head. Now remember, you have to remove any chrome before you try and glue parts together at the gluing points, or it won't stick. Now the carburetor is assembled, and then we're going to cut some tubing for the pieces as prescribed in the instructions, and the spark plug will be painted flat black. Then the choke line is added to the left, and the throttle lines then, as we mentioned, were cut and installed to the carburetor assembly. Now the tubing that came with the kit was kind of hard, and sometimes you'll have to warm it up in order for it to fit over the nipples that receive them and expand the ends there. Or sometimes you can just put something into the end, like the end of a straight pin or even a pencil, and widen it out so that it doesn't break the nipples off when you glue it together. Now we can mirror that assembly on the right side, including the exhaust flanges, carburetors, and lines, except for the one missing line on the right side there. And we will be adding those to the motor assembly soon. In the meantime, I wrote the part numbers and kept the assemblies in see-through baggies so that I could keep them straight. And I just wrote the part numbers on the bags to make sure that I identified them properly until proper assembly point is reached to put them into place. Now I want you to gather up these parts, and we're going to glue the engine block halves together. And then the crankcase bottom is glued to the block. The gearbox back plate is then glued to the back of the engine block assembly. And the engine front is glued to the front of the engine block. Next, the air filter housing, part number 19, is glued to the housing number 20, and then the air filter housing assembly is glued to the engine block. The choke gets glued to the air filter number 19 piece, and then the air intake tube on the left outside section is glued to the tube on the inside section, and then the left cylinder assembly gets glued to the engine block. Now 2 of the pushrod tubes are glued to the engine block and the cylinder bottom on the left. The left carb is then glued onto the left side, and the left air intake tube is assembled and glued to the left carburetor and left air filter housing. Now the air intake tube on the right and all the rest of the parts are mirrored on the right side. For your examination, here are a couple of side views of the motor assembled so that you can see how that looks after it's completely assembled, and you can get the parts into the proper position. We can start working on the wheel assemblies now, and we'll start with the front wheel here. And as you can see, there's a little bit of flash there that just needs to be trimmed off by a hobby knife. But otherwise, the chrome is still pretty good on this old kit. And now we can add the front wheel hub installed on the front wheel's left side. So just place that in there, and then the brake cooling fins, 4 each, are slid into the interior side of the front wheel hub. And the front wheel on the right side then is installed on the front tire and glued to the left side. Remember to scrape off that chrome. And the front axle can be installed in the front wheel hub and glued there on the right side. Instructions are a little bit vague here, so this is just a shot of the brake cooling fins that can be seen, and this will show you how they're positioned in the wheel. So locate the parts for the rear wheel, and it's essentially built the same way. We'll work on the tires, fenders, forks, etc. now, and I wanted to retain the look, the nice clean look of the box art, so I painted the fender with a gloss blue. And then the front fork on the left side is glued to the front fork on the outside, so the inside and the outsides are put together. And then the right inside is glued to the right outside. Now the rubber boot section on both of the front fork assemblies are painted flat black. The triple there is installed into the front fork on the right side, and the headlight bracket right side on the inside is glued to the front fork right outside, locking the triple clamp into place. The left side of the triple clamp then is installed into the left fork assembly, and the headlight bracket on the inside is glued to the front fork assembly. Now the bracket on the left is glued to the left outside, locking the triple clamp in place, and the front fender mounting bracket gets glued to the fork assembly. Now the front fender then is glued in to the fender mounting bracket, and then the front fender support is glued to the interior of the front fender and the front fork assembly. Now the brake lever is glued to the front brake backing plate, and that is installed into the front tire assembly, and the front tire assembly is installed into the fork. Now the brake torque link can be glued to the front brake backing plate and the front fender mounting bracket. Then the front brake line is cut and attached to the front brake lever. Gather up the fuel tank and the related parts, and then the left and right halves are painted blue like the fender was, and the gas tank insert on the left is glued to the left half, and then the right insert is glued to the right half. Now the tank cap is glued to the gas tank assembly on the top, and the fuel line petcock is glued to the gas tank on the left half, and then the second fuel line is glued to the right half. It's time to work on the frame and some related pieces like pegs, so go ahead and gather these parts out of the kit, and the battery top, case, and mount, and then the frame right half, center tube, and the right and left pegs then are all painted semi-gloss black. Then the foot peg on the right and left have some detail. They get painted a little Model Masters flat black as well, and both the ignition coil right halves and left halves are painted with flat black too. The top of the battery is glued to the battery case, and the battery assembly then glued to the mount. Now the center tube is glued to the right frame half, and then the battery mount assembly is glued to that right frame half as well. The engine assembly is glued in place on the right side too. Now remember to remove any paint or chrome before you glue parts together. Now the left half is glued to the right half of the frame, the engine assembly, and the center tube. Make sure that the parts stay in contact. Use some light clamps if you need to. And then the right foot peg is installed through the frame on the right half into the engine, and the swing arm on the top half is glued to the bottom half and then installed onto the frame. The foot peg then on the left is installed on the left side and into the engine assembly. Now the ignition on the right half is glued to the left twice, and then one of the ignition coils is glued to the right half and the other to the left of the frame on the frame. Then the horn face gets glued to the horn, and that assembly is glued to the center tube. there are two spark plug cables that are cut and installed from the ignition coils to the spark plugs. And now we're going to install the clutch cable, and it gets cut to length and attached to the clutch lever, and then the lever is glued to the gearbox plate and the kickstarter glued to the gearbox plate. Now in retrospect, these parts would have been easier to install if the swing arm assembly was not yet put into place, so you might want to do that first. The red arrow here is a side view showing how the kickstarter gets installed and where it's positioned, and it's helpful to use some tweezers here to position it with a little quick setting glue. The rear fender is also gloss blue, and now it gets installed into the motorcycle frame assembly in the back. Gather up these pieces and we'll work on these. The shock absorber on the inside is glued to the outside on the left, and then the assembly is glued to the left side of the frame. The wheel hub gets installed into the rear wheel assembly, and then the drive shaft flange is glued to the wheel hub. Now the rear wheel assembly can be installed into the motorcycle's frame. The drive shaft flange then is glued to the swing arm assembly, and the shock absorber inside half is glued to the right half on the outside. And then the shock absorber assembly gets glued to the right side of the frame and the wheel hub. Now the rear brake rod gets glued to the wheel hub and motorcycle frame. Next we'll work on these pieces to assemble the top end with the headlight, etc. And there's a lot going on here, so the headlight right half and left then are they're painted gloss black, and the fork assembly gets installed into the bottom of the neck of the frame. Now the fork crown is installed into the top of the neck and glued to the fork assembly. The speedometer cable gets cut to length and attached to the bottom of the speedo. Next, the headlight on the right half is glued to the left half, and then the speedometer is glued to the top of the headlight assembly, and the cable is ran through a hole in the bottom of the headlight housing. Now the headlight reflector gets glued to the headlight housing, and the lens is glued to the reflector using some clear part cement or white glue. The switch is glued to the top of the headlight assembly, and the handlebars have some detail that are painted flat black and then glued to the fork crown. Now the throttle is painted gloss black and glued to the right side of the handlebars. The steering damper is painted some gloss black and glued to the front crown by the handlebars as well, and both indicator light lenses are painted with some clear orange. Next, the indicator light lenses are both glued to the indicator lights with some clear part cement or white glue, and the turn indicator light assemblies are then glued to the left and right sides of the fork assembly. Now the throttle cables from the right and left carbs are attached to the handlebars, and the headlight cable from the front of the engine is attached to the bottom of the headlight housing. Next, the front brake cable from the brake lever is attached to the right side of the handlebars, and the clutch cable from the clutch lever then is attached to the left side of the handlebar. Get these pieces out, we'll add them next, and the center stand is painted gloss black and glued to the frame underneath there, and the right peg is painted flat black and glued to the left rear side of the motorcycle's frame. That's the rear foot peg, and then the grab handle gets glued to the left side of the frame. Now there's a detail on the battery cover left that's box art, and it's painted blue to match the detail, and so we used a little of that gloss blue. And then the battery cover left is glued to the left side of the frame. Now the Gearshift lever gets installed to the left side of the engine assembly. Find these pieces, and then we'll paint the license plate bracket a semi-gloss black and glue that to the rear fender. Now the turn indicator lenses are painted clear orange, and then the indicator lenses are glued to the housings, and then the test with some testers or clear part cement or white glue, and the indicator housing assembly then is glued to the rear fender above the license plate bracket. Now the taillight lens is painted clear red, and the housing is sprayed gloss blue. Taillight lens is glued to the taillight housing with some clear part cement or some white glue, and then attached to the rear fender above the license plate bracket. The foot brake is then glued to the rear brake lever, and the rear footrest on the right is painted flat black before being glued to the right side of the frame. Now the battery cover on the right has some detailing that's painted gloss blue, and it's glued to the right side of the motorcycle. Locate the exhaust pieces, and the exhaust pipe on the outside left half is glued to the exhaust pipe left inside half, and then the muffler left top half is glued to the bottom, and the exhaust pipe on the right, the outside half there is glued to the right inside half, and the muffler on the right is glued to the bottom of that. Now the exhaust balance tube half is glued to the exhaust balance tube half as well. The instructions seem to call for some tabs to be cut off the exhaust pipes, but I didn't have any tabs here, so they may have modified that mold over time. Now the left exhaust pipe gets glued to the left exhaust flange and the foot peg, and the left muffler gets glued to the left pipe and the motorcycle frame. Now we can add the right exhaust pipe to the exhaust flange, and then the right foot peg, and the right muffler then is glued to the right side of the motorcycle frame, and then the exhaust balance tube is glued between the left and right pipes. Find these parts and we'll paint the seat semi-gloss black, and the fuel tank gets installed into the frame. Now the seat handle is glued to the seat, and the seat then is inserted into the motorcycle frame. The side stand gets glued to the left frame and the left muffler, and since the decals are from the 70s, I had sprayed them with a little bonder to make sure that they didn't fall apart. And then the fuel tank decals, the license plate, and the speedometer decals are applied to the kit. Here is a top view so that you can see the assembly to date, and also note the speedometer decal that can be seen installed there. And finally, the license plate decal can be installed in the back. It is starting to curl up, and so I used a spare that I had actually, and I just cut the decal out with the backing paper still on it, covered it up with some clear Scotch tape, and then glued it into position, and that way it stays nice and straight and flat. Well, there you have it. This is a great looking kit when it's finished. It goes together pretty easily. Although some of the illustrations aren't the best, you can use the photos here to assemble your kit. They're still available, and you can find them on the internet at fairly reasonable prices in many different versions, including a police version. And if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you liked this step-by-step premium model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the icon for our site on the lower right hand of your video. And if you could want to, you could find us on Facebook or at our website rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.